Hello and welcome back. This is part 4 of your session 16 lecture in the history of healing. And this is our final part of this lecture. And in this part, we're going to just touch on some of the things that are going to feed us forward into our study of some of the complementary therapies and allied health as we move through the rest of the semester. So this is a little bit of a taster. So starting off with the advent of what we consider to be modern nursing now, we have Florence Nightingale during this time, and she lived from 1820 to 1910. She was a British woman, and she was the foundational philosopher of modern nursing practice. And I'm sure that we've all heard of Florence Nightingale. Her nickname was the Lady of the Lamp because she did her rounds at hospital at night and provided comfort and support to the ill and the wounded at that point in time. She was also a big driver of social reforms in healthcare and nursing, and she established secular nursing education, so nursing as education as separate from the church. She was the first woman who was awarded the British Order of Merit. That was in 1907, so just 3 years before her death. And International Nurses Day is observed annually on May 12th, which is her birthday, to celebrate the important role of nurses in healthcare. The breadth of her efforts at hospital and nursing reform are vast, from organizational aspects to hygiene to provision of psychological comfort and distractions to those that were suffering. And we're going to talk a lot more about the history of nursing to be covered in a later lecture of allied health a bit later this semester. Meanwhile, in Australia, and we want to touch on what was going on in Australia because we've been focusing predominantly on Britain and other parts of Europe and the US until now. Medical care was provided during this period of time through a mix of the colonial medical service and private medical practitioners. Common childhood infections were quite absent in Australia until the 1830s, but mortality rates were generally high up until the 1880s. Australian doctors were generally trained in Britain, so European medical advances came to Australia very quickly. Melbourne, Sydney, and Adelaide all opened medical schools in 1862, 1883, and 1885. And there were attempts at outlawing practice by unorthodox practitioners that failed across this period of time. So we did have unorthodox practitioners sort of still out there and practicing amongst the general population. The colonial medical service was originally organized for the medical needs of the penal colonies, but it was later expanded in its scope to cover everybody. And doctors of the colonial medical service were salaried by the government. Maternal mortality rates during this point in time in Australia stayed quite high, even after the death rates from communicable diseases declined later in the century. And the outlawing of unorthodox practitioners failed in Australia, but we're going to see in just a minute about how that turned out differently in America. So the politics of medicine in America were, well, quite political, I suppose. I know that's redundant, but so the American Medical Association developed a significant amount of political power and influence during the time span that we've been talking about in this lecture. In particular, the Carnegie Foundation hired a man named Abraham Flexner to systematically visit and inspect 155 medical schools in North America in 1907. And the thrust of that, the visits and inspections, was to look at the quality of education in medical schools. He issued his report known as the Flexner Report in 1910, and he recommended the strengthening of the first class and middle rank schools and essentially closing all of the rest of them. In 1910, the AMA membership was about 70,000 physicians. So if you think about that, that's actually a considerable political body for that point in time. And by 1915, after the Flexner Report, only 104 schools remained open. And by 1929, only 76 schools remained open of those in North America. So I'm going to go into a bit more detail about this. That was just sort of an overview of the situation. And the reason that we go into more detail about this is because it did significantly impact the development of naturopathy and homeopathy and other forms of complementary medicine in America, which then also influenced the development of those worldwide across during this period of time and up through even the present day now. And so we're going to spend a bit of time talking about this Flexner report. So the sciences at the time, both in medicine and other areas, were moving very firmly into the philosophy of nature being man's destiny to overcome. So this is a continuation of that mode of thought that arose during the Enlightenment, that it is man's purpose to overcome nature and that man can subdue and control nature. So pesticides were developed to kill insects, which also killed other creatures. Farming practices became more industrialized. Medicine took the upper hand over nature with germ theory and antibiotics and vaccines. And industrialization in general created really supernatural productivity, not supernatural in the way that we've been talking about it mystically in the past, but supernatural in terms of productivity that wouldn't be possible without the machines, along with escalating speeds of utilization of natural resources. So we have industry mining natural resources and utilizing natural resources at a rate that's never been seen before on the planet. And this attitude of technology and science being superior to traditional practice in all areas was played out in the politics of medicine during the late 19th and early 20th century in this sequence of events that's here on this slide. So in 1847, the American Medical Association was first formed, and it was mostly comprised of an eclectic group of practitioners that were of low social status. But by the late 1800s, an influx of European doctors from wealthy families had transformed the AMA into an association that was wealthy and cohesive political body. And during the same time, medical education was being modeled on Europe's medical education as developed in the US in universities such as Harvard, and a new program at Johns Hopkins University in 1893 began to require that medical students have completed a university degree prior to undertaking medical education. And that is a system that still persists in America today, and really not much anywhere else in the world. So parallel to this, Andrew Carnegie and John Rockefeller were amassing huge amounts of wealth in iron, coal, and oil industries, and they both set up charitable trusts to make funds available to developing social institutions. The AMA took advantage of that opportunity and utilized funds that they provided in order to work towards the systematization of medical education in the U.S. based on this model that had been established at Johns Hopkins University, and to eliminate what they considered to be inferior schools. And it so happens that most of the inferior schools were schools that were teaching homeopathy or naturopathy or other complementary therapies. And so, and also some of the inferior schools were schools that were taking Black students, so African Americans, mostly from ex-slave families. They established the Council on Medical Education, and that is still in existence today as a regulatory body of medical education in the U.S. And so we asked, what were the effects of this Flexner report, aside from what's seen on the surface and the closing of so many schools? Medical education and medical practice became more standardized and more rigorous, with a loss of eclecticism and diversity in the practice of perspective and also treatment approaches, as well as a real stifling of creative academic thought and work in medicine at that time. Medical education increasingly became the privilege of the wealthy, and its increased prestige helped to ensure ongoing wealth in that same population. And it took it out of the reach of many in society to pursue an education in medicine. This was particularly true for Black Americans, and their schools were all but wiped out by Flexner's opinion that Black people should only treat Black people. All but 2 of their schools were closed. And the schools teaching forms of medicine that didn't comport with the medical model of the 2 years of laboratory sciences, followed by 2 years of hospital-based internship, following an undergraduate degree as a prerequisite, those schools were essentially wiped out as well. Those included osteopathy, chiropractic, and homeopathy, which we're going to cover later in the semester, as well as the eclectics and the physiomedicalists, who we will talk about in our lecture on naturopathic medicine. Rockefeller then sewed it all up by providing a huge amount of funding to implement the recommendations to support and build the already first-class schools to make them even stronger. And as this proceeded, the world became embroiled in World War I, with some European medical schools destroyed, and Rockefeller gave large amounts of money in order to rebuild those schools in Europe as well, using the model of education that had been established as recommended by the Flexner Report in the US. And so you see the US sort of backward influencing European medical education through the use of money from these very, very wealthy industrialists. What we also see in Western medicine during this time is a decline in vitalism as a theory of practice. So vitalism in Western medicine was first clearly articulated in the 1700s, the late 1700s in France, as the vital principle. It was a widespread concept in European medical thought and philosophy by the 1840s. And holism and vitalism were considered to be inextricably intertwined. So the medical style of a vitalist or holistic practitioner really placed more power in the hands of the patient and in the patient's subjective experience than did the more reductionist view of medicine. So some at the time expressed vitalism in terms of everything being one, and that one being the soul of the universe. So this is a very, very broad holistic view. And the reason we're covering it in this lecture is that it provides the basis or the jumping off point for the study of homeopathy and naturopathy, which we'll take up in the coming lectures, as well as nutritional medicine. So this view of vitalism was not seen as being contradictory to a mechanical thought about how life works. The mechanics were seen as sort of being a subset of the whole, but the vital principle was more about the nature of life. And then as scientific medicine expanded its scope, there was a separation of the vitalists who were more in line with the philosophers from the past, from the laboratory medicine proponents who were working in a more reductionist field. And that's what we've been talking about in this lecture up until now. Vitalism was seen to be a more humanistic approach to medicine in terms of really respecting the experience of the whole patient, while laboratory medicine was transforming the patient into an object in many ways. And so vitalism in the early 19th century was blended with ideas of spirit, of passions, of the psyche, the mind, the senses. And so some people looked at it as being sort of an antiquated view, because these are themes that we've seen through the development of medicine from a very early time, and the idea of the spirit being involved in the vital nature of the person and their ability to heal. Vitalism remained the most alive in France through the mid-1800s and gravitated to sitting mostly within the field of psychology at that time. And at one point in the mid-century, vitalism was considered a sort of middle ground between the mechanistic assertions of the materialists and the spiritual or religious orthodoxy of the time. So it was kind of walking the line between those two. it certainly wouldn't be seen as any kind of a middle ground at this point in time in the present. German philosophers at that time were also in with the concept of vitalism and juxtaposed it with the rise in materialism, which they found to lack life and lacking a connection to the mysteries of the world. And vitalism was the major vestige that was left of metaphysics in science and natural philosophy within the realm of medicine. So writers such as Emerson and Thoreau spoke the language of vitalism as well during this time, and they connected, for the most part, all of it to nature. Everything was connected to nature for them. Later in the century, as germ theory took hold and modern sciences advanced, the theory of vitalism was really minimalized over time in favor of the idea of the body as a machine that could eventually all be explained by physical and chemical phenomena. And so we'll talk a lot more about the concepts of the vital force as we discuss the complementary therapies in the coming weeks. But it's worth noting the similarities in this discussion with the discussion earlier in the semester of similar concepts of chi or prana, which have persisted in the Eastern cultures across millennia and are still actively in use in healthcare today. We're also going to touch just briefly on the advent of psychology here. We have an entire lecture on psychology later on in the semester, so this will just be a brief introduction for now. So modern psychology as a science and a discipline began in the late 19th century, though medical thought had included mental and emotional aspects of being for some time before that. You'll go back to remembering that Avicenna talked about the 4 temperaments and really developed kind of personality typing and the idea of the personality being linked to the state of a person's health. And so that's back at 1000 of the Common Era. So this has been the idea of mind and psychology has been around for quite a long time, but the formal science and discipline of psychology really came into being in the late 19th century. And the image here on this slide is B.F. Skinner. He was a leading behavioral psychologist in the 1930s. So the founding fathers of psychology, Wilhelm Wundt and William James of Germany and the U.S. And behaviorism was dominant in the field in the first half of the 20th century. So that's B.F. Skinner was a behavioralist there on the slide. And the focus was on objectively observable behaviors and excluded subjective matters of consciousness. So psychology was studying what could be observed from the outside of a person about how they were behaving and what might be driving those behaviors, as opposed to talking to a person and hearing from them what their motivators might be. So that's an interesting perspective that we would consider incomplete these days. And this was, though, very aligned with the mechanistic approach of medicine at the time, that it wasn't so much about the subjective experience of the patient or even the subjective wellness of the patient necessarily, but it was about how does this machine work, essentially. And we would be remiss in not touching on hydrotherapy as we did at the end of the last section as we feed forward into our alternative and complementary medicines for the rest of the semester. So a major character in the realm of hydrotherapy during this period of time that we're studying in this lecture, Vincent Priesnitz. He was an untrained and unschooled peasant farmer in, I believe, Switzerland or Austria. I'm sorry, I've forgotten. And he first treated animals and then people with cold water, and later using sweating treatments as well. And the way that he came up with his treatments was that he observed what animals did when they were injured out in nature. And he noticed that, for example, if an animal were limping, say a deer were limping and seemed to have an injury to one of its legs, then it would go and stand in a cold stream, and it would take the cold water from that stream as something that would help to heal whatever injury that it had. And so he learned from that how to apply cold water to his farm animals, and he saw that they healed, and then he started applying that to people. And he wasn't a doctor, so he was a big threat actually to the medical establishment of the time in Europe because he had huge successes in treating people. In 1840, he treated over 1,600 people who came from around the world to be healed by him. And finally, the Austrian government, he was Austrian. The Austrian government gave him special permission to treat people because of his successes, despite the fact that he wasn't a doctor. So we will focus more on the 18th and early 19th century histories of specific medical theories outside of conventional medicine, such as hydrotherapy, as we move through the coming weeks. And today really has focused mostly on what's been happening in scientific medicine. But we don't want to ignore the fact that there were developments in what are now our systems of complementary medicine happening during this time as well. So that's the end of this lecture, and we will see you in session number 17. Your revision questions here are there, and they're on your LMS, and your other food for thought question at this time. We have now completed our trip through European medical history. So this is the end of European medical history as a focus. What surprised you the most? And what has left the greatest lasting impression on you about the development of medicine in Europe across all of the centuries that we studied? So I'll leave you with that, and thank you for joining.